Well, thank you very much, Barbara. As they used to say in the old Monty Python show, and now for something completely different, when I saw that I was going to be speaking on East-West, and I thought, okay, as an economist, how am I going to address that? And I thought, well, the logical thing would be to look at what's been done to promote growth in transition economies, to in effect help them catch up to Western nations and make up for the decades of communist enslavement that they suffered. And so what I want to do is look at the economics of transition in the East and consider specifically what I think is a counterproductive role of international organizations. When I write that growth is lagging, I suppose I should specify what that means, because on average, growth has probably actually been a little bit better in Eastern countries than Western countries. But what I'm really talking about is the fact that growth should be much higher if we want a process of convergence, if we want the Eastern countries to become as rich as the Western countries. And if you have substandard growth, if you don't have that convergence, if post-communist countries are still going to only average 50% of the per capita GDP of Western countries, that's probably not going to be a good story. Now, obviously, there are dozens of countries that emerged from the ex-Soviet bloc. Some of them, we heard a representative from Georgia earlier. That's a relative success story. They still have a long way to go. Estonia, the Czech Republic. There are some decent success stories in the former Soviet bloc, but there are definitely still, the region as a whole is lagging. And of course, for those that follow security issues, that's not me, I'm just the economist, countries like Russia would be a special concern. Now, for those of us that are familiar with either Fraser's Economic Freedom of the World or Heritage's Index of Economic Freedom, or for that matter, the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, there are several indices out there, indexes, that can be used to judge the economic policy of a country. And they all basically share the same metrics: fiscal policy, regulatory policy, monetary policy, trade policy, and quality of governance, rule of law, legal, whatever you want to call that last one. But it's sort of a catch-all for the actual institutional structure and operation of the government. So those are the policy levers that you would want to appropriately use to get better economic performance in the post-Soviet economies. And if you look at, I used the Economic Freedom of the World from Fraser when I did my calculations. What I found is that the biggest gap between Eastern European and post-Soviet countries and Western European countries was the rule of law, quality of governance. Again, however you want to describe that catch-all phrase. That's really where these countries are lagging the most. They don't have good institutional structures. There's still a lot of cronyism, corruption, favoritisms, and other things that erode the rule of law. So let's now back up for a second and just think for what actually is economic growth. Because we have this confusion in the United States when people are debating things like Keynesian economics. But it's a very simple concept that I think even if Paul Krugman was up here, he would agree. What are the two factors of production? Capital and labor. If you want more economic output in your economy, you either need more capital, more labor, or you need to use your existing labor and capital more efficiently. And so when I'm trying to convince people about the benefits of good policy, whether we're talking about just long-run structural growth in Eastern Europe, whether we're talking about fights over stimulus and Keynesianism in the United States, this is what I always try to get them to understand. Capital, labor, more and better. That's fundamentally where our interest and the discussion should be. And when you think of capital and labor as the two ingredients in an economy, then I think the logical way to think about it is who's the chef that mixes those ingredients together? Well, do you have private chefs, people in the private capital markets, entrepreneurs, people like that, determining how labor and capital are going to be mixed? Or will it be governments? Or in the case of what I'm talking about today, will it be international bureaucracies and international organizations? And of course, several people yesterday were talking about the unfortunate negative role of the OECD in trying to promote tax harmonization and bigger government. The IMF is another international bureaucracy that has really taken on an aggressive left-wing approach in terms of public policy. But it could also be national governments. Obviously, in most cases, the real problem in the post-Soviet economies is not so much that the international bureaucracies are recommending higher taxes, although God knows that happens far too often. It's that the national governments themselves are imposing bad policy, and then the international bureaucracies simply come in and sort of just add icing to the cake by recommending higher taxes and making things even worse. And I already mentioned that, that the OECD and the IMF have a special negative place in my heart for their aggressive promotion of higher taxes and bigger government. But even the multilateral development banks, the World Bank being the sort of global version, but there are now all sorts of regional multilateral development banks that are getting involved in the issue. African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank. But since our topic is East and West, I thought I would focus on the role of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which, much to my surprise, when I started looking at this a couple of months ago, the United States is actually the single biggest shareholder in this organization, even though it was created after the collapse of the Soviet Empire for the ostensible purpose of Europe helping to build up its cousins on the eastern side of the continent. And the problem with all these multilateral development banks, and the problem actually with foreign aid in general, is that it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it's mostly government-to-government transfers. I have a couple of quotes here from development economists that are very well-known, very famous. Peter Bauer has the famous quote about foreign aid being a method of transferring money from poor people in rich country to rich people in poor countries. That's basically just capturing the notion that foreign aid winds up lining the pockets of the incumbent politicians in the poor countries. And William Easterly points out that economic growth does not come from foreign aid. It comes from economic and political reform inside a country, which in my mind, I've never seen one of them put the quote exactly this way, so I don't give this next slide, I don't give it credit to one of them, but it's really a compilation of their thoughts. I call it the foreign aid paradox. Poor nations with good policy will grow even if they don't get foreign aid, and poor nations with bad policies won't grow no matter how much aid they receive. If you look at the sweep of post-World War II history, and you look at the really super success stories out there like the Asian tigers, they did not grow because of foreign aid. They grew because if you look at the Economic Freedom of the World Index, you look at those 5 major categories of public policy, they became free market success stories. Matter of fact, Hong Kong and Singapore routinely now are number 1 and number 2 in the world. Well, if the same thing happened in Moldova, where we'll be next year for the Resource Bank, I guarantee you Moldova would grow very rapidly. However, if Hong Kong and Singapore had been saddled with the IMF and the OECD telling them to have big modern welfare states and stuff like that, they never would have become big success stories. Now, let's specifically talk about the EBRD, since the topic of this panel is East versus West. Here's the problem. The multilateral development banks historically followed a bad model. It was government-to-government transfers. But at least it was theoretically for things like infrastructure. So they had a story they could tell. Now, of course, the infrastructure wound up costing 5 times more than it should have. And oftentimes there were environmental concerns. And the whole thing, of course, was rife with corruption and cronyism. But in some sense, you can at least see what they were trying to do. The EBRD is doing something completely different than other multilateral development banks. Their core model, their business model, is they don't give money to governments. They do cronyism. They give money to private businesses. In other words, you have these bureaucrats at the EBRD going into different countries and deciding, no doubt with lots of cronyism and influence peddling, they're deciding, okay, we're going to give money to this company or this company, supposedly to try to jumpstart the economy. But economists understand that, as I mentioned before, capital and labor being the two factors of production, if you have government officials distorting the allocation of capital, you are going to do immense damage to your economy, and yet that is the model of the EBRD. A couple of minutes. Yeah, I'm coming near the end. Don't worry, Barbara. I get all excited about this. The misallocation of capital is the macroeconomic problem with the EBRD. The cronyism and the corruption are sort of the operational micro problems with the EBRD. I want to close up by pointing out there are a few other problems. The EBRD was set up to be the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They've now spread to MENA countries, Middle East and North Africa, and they've just announced in the last week that they now want to go to sub-Saharan Africa. It's becoming just another World Bank, another big bloated international bureaucracy filled with people getting tax-free salaries, running around the world doing cronyism and corruption. And I call this, I think this is my second to last slide, the OECD-ization of the EBRD. The OECD, of course, being the most aggressively left-wing international bureaucracy. Well, here are quotes from different EBRD documents. Taxing wealth may be an effective method of fiscal redistribution. That's also an effective way of destroying your economy. Tackling broader inequality, redistribution through taxes and public spending. No, the problem isn't inequality, it's poverty. And you actually make poverty worse when you focus on trying to force everyone to be equal after the fact. And then, of course, their sort of new fundamental mindset, unfettered markets can lead to suboptimal outcomes. Oh, as if government-controlled markets have ever led to a good outcome. So the bottom line is the post-Soviet economies should be copying Singapore and Hong Kong. Foreign aid is not a route in general, and the EBRD in particular is especially damaging because it's based on cronyism, and ultimately, and this is where I come back to the danger of populism that I mentioned at the start, when you have the EBRD playing favorites, doing cronyism and corruption, picking out special politically connected firms to get special grants, of course that's going to cause people in different countries to say this is a corrupt system, the free market must not work. But of course what they're really upset about is that the government is involved, but they don't know that. And that's why I worry in the long run that bureaucracies like the EBRD are going to undermine support for free markets in addition to slowing growth and hindering convergence. Thank you very much.